from an early age, Ryuen came to the understanding that fear is a part of human nature. Psychologically, if you break someone down, bring them into a corner, their true nature will shine. And that's why Ryuen was abnormal, because not once in his life did he ever feel fear. When he was in elementary school, he came across a large snake on a class trip, and he wasn't afraid of being bitten. Some of his classmates watched with great interest, but from a safe distance. Some were scared, and others couldn't care less. But there was one notion that was pervasive through every student. They wanted the snake to die. The adults panicked, they cried for help, but Ryuen simply grabbed a rock and bashed the snake's head. He was not afraid. His classmates screamed, his teachers were in a frenzy, but Ryuen didn't care. He wanted to destroy the snake that everyone feared. And so Ryuen learned something about himself that day. The moment that his enemy succumbs to fear, he feels a rush of adrenaline. Fear and pleasure are two sides of the same coin. Violence rules the world, and the way you go about defeating your enemies defines your accomplishments. The snake's death was his first unextinguishable victory. Since that day, he's had many foes, but not once did he ever feel fear. They all bowed down to him. And that's because Ryuen believed that those who possess an unparalleled capacity for violence are truly elite. But a problem arose. As he grew up, that same pleasure he felt from his opponent's fear disappeared. He became complacent, bored, with nothing to motivate him. He was unsatisfied because his greatest wish would never be given, and that was to be overthrown. Ryuen wanted to feel fear. Now with Ayanokoji, he doesn't understand emotion in the slightest. It just isn't within his capacity. He's never felt anything. No anger, happiness, sadness, frustration, guilt, nothing. He's an empty void, swallowing everything in his path. And to satisfy his own objectives, he plays games like he's the Joker. Since his first confrontation with Ryuen, back when Sudo was on the verge of being expelled, Ayanokoji started laying the groundwork. He carried these thoughts into the uninhabited island exam, where he set the stages to expose Ryuen and make Class D turn the tables on him, and Class C would get last place. On the cruise ship, another opportunity arose, with K and the girls from Class C. While pulling the strings, he could make K his pawn, while simultaneously getting Ryuen's attention. It was brilliant. And since he set up Horikita as the mastermind of Class D, he understood that Ryuen would seek her out. And when the sports festival arrived, he already predicted that Ryuen would use many underhanded tactics. From his estimations, he expected that Kushida was the traitor and was working in cahoots with Ryuen. And by blackmailing the girls from Class C who tormented K, he could flip the script on Ryuen and Kushida. During the time of the paper shuffle exam, Ayanokoji anonymously contacted Ryuen. He knew it wasn't Horikita and someone was pulling her strings. At this point in time, Ryuen had suspicions of who the true mastermind of Class D was. But his answer was not definitive, and while Ayanokoji messed around with him, he made friends and used them as his mask. He simply blended into the background and downplayed himself to hell. Finally, we have the stage set. Everything is ready for the rooftop. Ayanokoji knowingly set up Kei to be Ryuen's target. He forced her into a position to be psychologically tormented. Now this served two purposes. The first was to get Ryuen and his cohorts into the right setting. The second was to test the resolve of Kei. If Ayanokoji plans to use her as his pawn, he needs to see for himself how far she's willing to go. Just how tight are the bonds of her loyalty. And through Ryuen's psychological and physical torment, she did not crack under the pressure. And so everything was put into place. Ayanokoji goes up to the rooftop and exposes himself to everyone there. And they almost didn't believe him, because it's Ayanokoji. He just portrays himself like he's no one special. But quickly they begin to realize the true gap in their power. Ayanokoji easily takes down Ishizaki, Albert, and Ibuki. And finally, it's him versus Ryuen. Now, while Ayanokoji is a martial arts expert, Ryuen has his own brand of combat, something he learned by himself. Ryuen is a fighter by nature. He will continue to seek out his opponent until he defeats them, until he is the last conqueror. But to say this fight was one-sided is an understatement. Ryuen, who rarely understood pain, felt pain. Ryuen, who was lost in his complacency, felt exhilarated. And Ryuen, who always saw emotion in his enemies, the fear, the sadness, the joy, and everything in between. When he looked at Ayanokoji, he saw nothing. His eyes were dead. His face was deadpan and expressionless, as it always was. And for the first time in his life, Ryuen felt fear. In contrast to his childhood, he was the snake getting crushed by the rock. Ryuen wanted to toy with Ayanokoji's emotions, but there was no heart for him to manipulate. And so Ayanokoji obliterated him until he lost consciousness. Like Icarus, when you get too close to the sun, you get burned. Ryuen, who was a god amongst men, was reminded of his humanity. And because of Ayanokoji, his wish was granted. He was defeated.